By 1851, Britain was the workshop of the world, producing 2/3 of the world's coal and half of all cotton, cloth, and iron produced in the world. The freeing up of trade enabled this dominance to continue and exports around the world to increase. The value of British exports in 1825 had been £38 million. By 1845, it was 60 million, and by 1869, it was 190 million. This increase in trade came from increasing contact with other countries outside the empire, particularly from North America and Latin America. Although the empire was increasing in size during the Victorian period, it provided few economic opportunities, and indeed, with the ending of economic preference for the colonies and the abolition of slavery and the slave trade, the Caribbean suffered greatly during this new free trade era. Although the American colonies were lost following the War for Independence, the USA was, until after the Civil War of 1861 to 65, dependent on Britain for textiles and most manufactured goods, whilst Britain imported 90% of her tobacco from the USA. It was a relationship that suited Britain and one that Britain hoped would last. Latin America was also an important area for British businessmen. The demand for textile goods in particular was important for the Lancashire textile factories, and as trade with South America increased, consuls were appointed to all the commercial bases to facilitate trade and deal with any problems that the British had. In the period between 1865 and 1914, 51% of Britain's overseas investment went to the Americas, and it was clearly the most important area for British trade, and particularly for sugar and coffee. The abolition of slavery and also the abolition of sugar tax on competition from outside the Caribbean hit the West Indies colonies very badly. Many plantations closed down and labor became increasingly difficult to come by. Freed slaves, understandably, did not want to return to the sugar plantations, and instead, indentured labor had to be brought in. 36,000 liberated Africans from St. Helena and Sierra Leone were brought to the West Indies, as were 100,000 Asians. These people were forced to work without pay for a set amount of time. So although slavery had been abolished, a new system of indentured labor was then created, and over 136 people worked on the plantations for no money. India, Britain's most important colony, had developed in terms of territorial acquisitions during the early 19th century, but most acquisitions were for strategic advantage or to increase the status of the commander concerned. Initially, in many ways, India was a liability for Britain. Over 2 million British people died in India during the 19th century, mainly from disease. And whilst the contribution of the Indian Army was substantial, the cost of maintaining large numbers of British soldiers in India was huge. In the early 19th century, India was not an important destination for British exports or investment. Most of the tea drunk by the British came from China, and it was only after the opening of the Suez Canal that India became more important for the British economy. With better transport links to India, investment in the country began to increase, with the investment in bridges, railways, irrigation, and new methods of transport. The relationship with India, though, was one that benefited the metropolitan power and the British, and did very little for most Indians. In fact, whilst the UK's textile industry was being industrialized, India's textile industry was being de-industrialized, and this was being done so that the British textile factories benefited. New crops were introduced to India, but most financial benefits went to the British investors. Assam was developed for tea and replaced China as Britain's source for tea. By 1900, Britain was importing £137 million weight of tea annually compared to just £24 million from China. Indian jute and cotton also became important resources for Britain. India also became an important source of labor for Britain after the abolition of slavery, because India provided over 25,000 Indians as indentured labor by 1838 and provided over 18,000 laborers to the sugar industry in Mauritius. The peak of this overseas settlement of migrant Indian labor came in 1858-1859 when 53,000 Indians went overseas, 45,000 of whom went to Mauritius. Despite the investment in India's infrastructure in the last quarter of the century, the British failed to make India a real economic asset, and its people continued to suffer from periodic famines. As British trade dominated the global economy, generating huge wealth for the British industry, much of the profits from the British trade were invested in capital projects around the world. Britain became, in the second half of the 19th century, not just the workshop of the world, but the world's banker. London was the financial centre of the world, with huge amounts of money being invested in railways, mining, ranching, and all kinds of industrial commercial development. Over half of the money invested went to areas outside the empire as investors sought new sources of raw materials and markets for Britain's industrial goods. And the returns from these investments ensured that Britain's balance of payments remained in surplus throughout the century. Throughout this global expansion of industry and business, the British government played a very supportive role. Former Prime Minister Palmerston claimed that the good deal of Foreign Office time was spent in dealing with the complaints of merchants abroad, and he was quite willing to intervene abroad using force to enforce the free trade. As an example, 3 wars were fought to enforce the opium trade on China between 1839 and 1860, and that was a typical example of the attitude taken by British governments throughout the century.